While a major component of early American history, the story of the removal of the 5 so-called civilized tribes of the Southeast is not well understood. And until recently, relatively little archaeological work has been done on sites along the route westward known as the Trail of Tears. But now, researchers are beginning to come to grips with what remains of these ephemeral places. Working at sites from the Cherokee homelands across the Mississippi to Indian country in what is now Oklahoma, archaeologists, historians, native leaders, and community activists are working together to preserve and interpret that story along the northern route. Listed on the National Register of Historic Places, the Snelson Brinker Farm was a stopping point for at least one detachment of about 1,000 starving, exhausted Cherokee on the Trail of Tears.
As it stands, this is what is left of the Snelson Brinker house. There was a fire July 4th, and they were doing an investigation because all indications point to arson.
In the aftermath of the fire, can the activists rescue history from the arsonists' flames? The farm and sites along the trail offer a wealth of information for researchers hoping to understand the process of genocide and ethnic cleansing in 19th century America.
As Katuwas and as Cherokees, this was where we had started from. This is where everything known to be Cherokee, the way in which we interpreted the world, all began here.
At sites across rural America, the family stories of Native, European, and African Americans collided in the early 19th century to create a cultural landscape that holds the history of America. In November of 2017, volunteers began clearing the farmhouse site in advance of the first stages of archaeological investigation. Erin Whitson is the lead investigator on the project. She grew up a few miles from the farm.
As it stands, this is what is left of the Snelson Brinker house. July 4th, 2017, the house burned after standing for so long, and now we're interested in doing archaeological investigations to try to figure out more about that early period of time. We know that they came and they probably had slaves with them when they got here. Don't exactly know how many at this moment in time. Hopefully in the future we'll find out a little bit more about them as part of the archaeological examination of the site. What we know for sure is that this was a working farmstead at one point, which means that there are probably more features here that we don't see. All that you see on the surface now that was original was a house, but as a farm they would have had barns, they probably would have had a stable, they would have had chickens, pigs for certain. So all of these things require other structures, and with slaves, they also would have needed a place to live themselves.
A classic example of the negative effects of westward expansion on native cultures, the Trail of Tears also chronicles the story of immigration and slavery. A diverse country like America holds evidence of colliding cultures in its soil. Archaeological research is imperative if we hope to understand and preserve our unique origin story.
Part of the project that we're proposing, we're going to be doing archaeological investigations to try to figure out more about that early period of time. First, doing what we call ground penetrating radar to see if we can find anomalies under the soil. We'd also eventually like to do a shovel testing survey where we walk so many meters and we dig a hole. And if we find things, we flag it for further investigation if it warrants it, and then from there move on and keep going until the whole 1.7 acres is surveyed. And hopefully by the end of this project, we'll know a little bit more about what it means to live in Missouri Ozarks in the 1830s.
We're situated about midway between the communities of St. James and Steelville. And about 2 acres left of what is the Snelson Brinker property. This is a site of national significance. It is on the National Trail of Tears, one of the 3 main routes to the state of Missouri, and it is incredibly endangered. It's so important not just to tell the story of this site, but this site's place in a larger tragic story of American history of Indian removal, essentially 4 centuries of genocide.
Frank Snelson is a direct descendant of Levi Snelson, who founded the farm.
I'm the 7th generation here. My grandfather and my dad and I at different times took care of this property. We took care of little country cemeteries around where our families are buried. And there's a lot of Snelson history here. When Levi Snelson had this cabin, they used it for a courthouse, 1835, 36, along in there, just before it was sold to the Brinkers. Levi Lane Snelson, in 1833, purchased this 40 acres. In 1834, he had the cabin built. And I saw the land grants, the certificates for the land. The president's name's Andrew Jackson on that, and it was the origin of the cabin. Levi crossed paths with Mr. John Thomas, who was a partner with Massey on the Merrimack Iron Works, then called the Massey Iron Works, and came west basically with the first movement into this iron ore deposit and the mining activity and the smelting and so forth at the ironworks that came with it.
In 1826, Thomas James and Samuel Massey founded what would become the Merrimack Iron Works along the banks of the river that flowed from the springs. Originally called the Massey Iron Works, the industrial complex was completed in 1829, and a company town of about 400 workers, families, and slaves quickly grew up around it. The ironworks was part of an industrial landscape, a reminder of the competing value systems between Native and European Americans, where one group saw value in land conservation and the other in developing its potential.
There's a lot of history with this property beyond that, I mean at a national level and even international. Starting in 1837 with the Cannon Detachment, the Cherokee people moved through here when they were dislocated from northeast Georgia and Tennessee and western North Carolina and trekked across here headed for Oklahoma and did it in the dead of winter.
Cherokee homelands were in the southern Appalachian Highlands, centered on the Great Smoky Mountains. By the 18th century, Cherokee claimed most of western North Carolina, a corner of South Carolina, parts of eastern Tennessee and northern Georgia, and their claims extended into parts of what is now Virginia, where they hunted and gathered wild plants. Farmers, who cultivated corn, beans, and squash in the region's river valleys, the Cherokee lived in permanent towns of several hundred people, and at the heart of the townships was the council house. Based on linguistic evidence, researchers believe that the Cherokee migrated into the region from somewhere near the Great Lakes. Cherokee tradition records this migration of the ancients.
You know, the other tribes in the southeastern United States, the other of what we call the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Creek, the latter Muskogee Creeks. Muskogee Creeks were a confederation of smaller tribes, oftentimes having their own dialect or their own language, which was Muskogean. The Choctaws and Chickasaws speak another Muskogean dialect. The Creeks and the Seminoles speak pretty much the same language. Then there's the Cherokees, and our language is Iroquoian stock, indicating that our ancestors are among the Iroquoian Confederacy and that our people migrated further south into the mountains at some time.
Writings on traditional history by Assistant Chief Charles Hicks in the 1820s, he related histories that were recited at the Green Corn Dance when he was a boy in the 1770s. As part of a migration cycle, he said that the Cherokee people finally stopped at a place near the heads of the Tuckasegee called Dalachishkoye, Two Sparrows Place. Katie Vann, in the 1830s, told Daniel Buttrick that one of the holy places that she identified in the Cherokee Nation was Dalachishkwee. The town sat amidst hills that were great towns of the immortals. This is the place from which Cherokee people spread out across their country. So this is a beginning place, just as Kadohi is a beginning place.
Tom Belt teaches Cherokee language and philosophy at Western Carolina University.
I remember when I was about 9 years old, listening to a conversation between my father and my grandmother, and my grandmother mentioning the origins of our people, the DIGADOHI, the Katua people. She told my father that it was said that we originated from one town, from one place, and this place was called Katua, or Gaduhwagin. And hence we took our name from that place, as one would take their identity from a place where they're at. So we were from Gaduhwagin, and we became Anigaduhwagi, or the people of that town, the people of Katua. As Katuas and as Cherokees, this was where we had started from. This is where we had begun the process of becoming a people. This is where our laws had been given us. This is where everything known to be Cherokee, that we can think of, every story, and very possibly even the bulk of our language, the way that we looked at the world, our cosmology, the way in which we interpreted the world, all began here.
Following the advice of American political leaders like Thomas Jefferson and looking to distinguish themselves from other Native Americans of the same era who were resisting assimilation, the Cherokee adopted many of the practices of white America.
Late 1790s, I want to say 1794, but somewhere along in there, we had some major battles with the settlers, with old John Sevier, first governor of Tennessee. We didn't fare very well, and we pretty much put away war making after that because that wasn't working out well for us.
Like many other Native peoples, the Cherokee intermarried with settlers who migrated into their homelands.
We were not all full-bloods even then. Many had intermarried with Scotch and Irish and others, and we had invited the missionaries in, not necessarily for religion, but because they offered schools. Before removal, 90% of the Cherokees could read and write. 90% of the folks in America can't read and write today. We had, a written newspaper. We had printed in Cherokee and English. Our people were thriving in the East before removal. Our leaders were educated back East. By virtue of owning all the land, there was not a tavern, a salt mine, a plantation that was not owned by Cherokee citizens.
Our people have good homes, some of them mansions, some of them still standing. They've got sturdy cabins, they have corn patches, they have a very good quality of life.
The Cherokee became some of the most successful business owners and planters in the South. Adopting the economic model of agri-industrial plantations, many Cherokee were also slave owners.
So we had, plantations that were known for the best grain in Georgia that were immediately bought up at the Georgia lottery.
After a number of treaties wherein they ceded considerable territory, First to the British and later to the United States, by the early 1800s, most of what was left of Cherokee territory sat within northern Georgia. In 1826, the Georgia legislature petitioned President John Quincy Adams to negotiate a removal treaty with the Cherokee Nation. Initially, Adams refused the request, but eventually gave in to their demands. After the election of Jackson in 1828, the Georgia state legislature passed a series of laws that nullified the government of the Cherokee Nation and abolished the Cherokee legislature and restricted the rights of Cherokee people. In 1829, gold was discovered on Cherokee land in the North Georgia mountains, which led to the Georgia Gold Rush, enticing large numbers of white settlers to enter the region. Subsequently, the Cherokee were forbidden to mine, and Cherokee lands were surveyed in preparation for distribution and white settlement. Jackson's influence and the lust for gold led to the passage of the Indian Removal Act on May 26, 1830. The act authorized the president to negotiate treaties to buy tribal lands in the east in exchange for land further west, outside of existing U.S. state borders.
Once the Treaty of Neosho was signed, Cherokees could no longer hold their councils in the state of Georgia. Red Clay became the de facto capital until our forced removal in 1838. And several large council meetings were held there discussing the removal situation. And we had many of our Cherokee leaders had been evicted from Georgia from there, such as John Ross from his big plantation, and he lived near Red Clay. And there were other leaders, John Martin, who was our treasurer of the Cherokee Nation, and later the first Chief Justice after removal of the Cherokee Nation. In February of 1836, a council meeting was held there with several hundred Cherokees present, and that's when Chief Ross, who was in Washington, had asked the assistant chief, George Lowry, to start a petition, which eventually they gained over 15,000 names opposing the treaty.
When the Cherokee were forced from their homeland and removed to Oklahoma, many passed through Missouri on the northern route. On this journey, they encountered a number of established communities in what was once part of the Louisiana Purchase. These European and American settlements occupied a space that had belonged to native societies for thousands of years. In 1821, Missouri was admitted to the United States as a slave state, as part of the Missouri Compromise that also saw Maine enter as a free state.
And the notion is that B.B. Cannon brought that first detachment up through here because it was a mercantile establishment, it was a county seat, and that was just the first of 10 detachments of about 1,000 people each that came through here. Once he came across the Mississippi, he had to hit old roads, probably 10-foot wide dirt paths at the best. He stopped where he could and got supplies. And as he came this way, he undoubtedly heard about the Snelson Brinker location because it was a mercantile establishment, it was a county seat, there was a spring nearby. Perhaps one more reason was that he could connect with the St. Louis to Springfield Road just 2 miles west of here on the other side of Massey Iron Works.
We know at least one group who for sure stayed here on the property itself. Some accounts say that they stayed between the house and the cemetery. While they were here, we do know that at least 4 individuals died. We knew 2 were older and 2 were younger, probably children. We're not real sure where they were buried. And so as part of the project that we're proposing, we're going to be trying to figure that out. So we are preparing as part of this project to do what we call ground penetrating radar, GPR. What that entails is us using a machine to shoot rays, basically radar, into the ground. Part of this is in hopes that we will establish the boundaries of a cemetery associated with, or possibly associated with, 4 individuals who died here.
Remote sensing technologies like ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, and photogrammetry are helping scientists answer questions about the past in a minimally invasive way. This is important when working on a site with potential human remains, and in historic preservation, where retaining the character of a site is important. National Park Service archaeologist Steve DeVore was on site to conduct the first phase of mapping and the ground-penetrating radar survey.
It's a GPS unit, a global positioning system. It's a mapping grade with external antenna. So I get a little bit better resolution, especially in timber. This is not as bad because the leaves are starting to fall, but in the middle of the summer, this would be hard to get good readings. I'm just going around and taking GPS readings, measurements along the fence line, along the boundary fence line. So I'll have locational information on it. You can do continuous lines and you can do area, but you'll end up with hundreds of readings. So I just go and take a reading every 5-10 meters, take the reading, stop it, pause it, and go on to the next stop. We're going to try a ground penetrating radar survey of the cemetery area. Hopefully, if the soil conditions are good, we might be able to identify the grave shafts. The ones associated with headstones, we'll be able to pick those up right away and then have an idea what might be present in unmarked areas. But right now, they're starting to lay out a grid. They've got a tape across here and they're going to put stakes in at every 20 meters. I have ropes measured out that are 20 meters long so I can lay them out. I have them marked off in meter and half meter, which allows me to keep track with the instruments or where I should be at. Some of the instruments have some kind of a metronome system on them where they will beep at a second or second and a half, whatever I set it for. But by setting that metronome, that allows me to collect so many points per meter along a traverse line, along a single line. As we do each grid, it was one file, and then I can build them all together into a composite for the whole site.
In April of 2018, Aaron met Judd Slivka and his team from the University of Missouri on site. The team used drones to gather hundreds of photographs and thousands of elevation data points to create photogrammetric maps of the farm and surrounding 40 acres. Their hope is that this will help them locate minute differences in the ground surface. When the results are combined with Steve's GPR survey, this will help Erin and her team decide where to dig next.
So when we flew, the pattern was to fly east to west, and so it would take a shot, and take another shot, and take another shot, and take another shot, and it would do it in east-west transects. And overlapping photos, we had that 75% overlap. I think one of the reasons why this is so compelling is because we're able to replace that very, very expensive commercial LiDAR deployment, but it may also have some other benefits to it.
I mean, this that we're looking at here, it's far higher resolution than anything that would be available. I think most of the state of Missouri is covered in LiDAR that's at 10-meter resolution, but this is like 7 to 10 centimeters.
You asked us to try and find some clues, and so we programmed a drone to fly over more or less the original homestead, automatically snapping photos as it went. And then each time it's taking a shot, it's embedding geopositioning data. When our drone was flying, what it was doing is that it was shooting oblique images. And when we compose oblique images together, along with the elevation data that comes from the drone sensors, we're able to create a 3D model. And what we found was that it was hard to see the ground, but where we could see the ground, we found a couple interesting things. And As we manipulate this around, you can begin to get a sense of what it would have looked like. And so we have the burned out cabin area, and we have that old spring house on the other side of that little cluster of trees. Okay, so let's go into that elevation model. That black dot surrounded by a gray line down towards the bottom, that's the cabin itself. Now, going back to the north, you all found some stuff that that was over on the side of the house. The thing that looks like a pipe is a fallen tree with its root ball. But you were interested in what was just a little bit to the north of that.
Rarely in nature do you find squares, perfect squares, or even semi-perfect squares, and that's a pretty good square.
Any idea what that could be?
We've got maps that say there was a barn there at one point. We also, on the surface, we've got some disturbance, and it looks like there's some domestic things coming out of the ground there, just sitting on the surface. We've got some ceramics, stuff like that. Usually you see those things around places where people are spending a lot of time eating and sharing food with other people. It certainly makes for a good area for potential slave quarters.
If the new information helps the archaeological team locate the slave house, they hope to excavate in order to learn more about the lives of the slaves who lived there. The documents record one tragic tale about a slave named Mary, a young mulatto girl who may have been descended from her master's family.
There was an incident here on the property in 1837 where a young girl who was listed on the rolls as having been mulatto, her name is Mary. On May 15th, 1837, the owners were loading up a cart so that they could take it to St. Louis. Well, they left their 3-year-old daughter with this young girl who was 13. They came back and the 13-year-old was still around, but they couldn't find their 3-year-old child. They finally found the child floating face down in a spring. She died either with that incident or she died from drowning, we don't know. Mary was brought to the courthouse, which is actually kind of amazing at the time that they gave her due process. And it went as far as the Missouri Supreme Court. For something as early as this, you don't expect justice for this child, and tried for a mistrial. So she was questioned after the fact in a place where she wasn't being threatened with her life. And she did, again, confess to the crime. And she was hung by the neck until dead, somewhere around Steelville. She is the youngest person in the state of Missouri to be legally executed still today.
The court documents from Mary's tragic case give us written evidence of the spring. This knowledge will help Aaron's team focus their efforts. Historian Deborah Kirk is working on a project to digitally preserve and record Cherokee stories from the Trail of Tears.
I have ancestors who walk the trail, of course. Everybody in the Cherokee Nation has ancestors who walk the Trail of Tears. Some of them died and are buried along the trail. For so long, the Cherokee citizens would not talk about the Trail of Tears, but also the younger generations of Cherokee, we want to know these family stories. My grandma, when I would ask her questions, do any of our relatives, did they say anything about it? And she would just say it was a cold, dark time. And for me, it was really important that I find where my ancestors walked. I wanted to walk in their footsteps. I wanted to honor them in that way.
Deborah's PhD research combines traditional Cherokee storytelling and digital technology to recreate Cherokee experiences along the Trail of Tears. In recording her people's historic loss, Deborah honors her family legacy.
For me, it's blending traditional with modern technology, capturing these stories, and then using the technology that I have to create the dramatic or create the experience. That's bringing in STEM components like LiDAR in a way that complements and enhances tradition.
Deborah's work incorporates scientific surveying methods used by archaeologists, geographers, and historians to record and interpret the landscape. Like photogrammetry, LiDAR involves flying a craft across a defined area. But instead of a photograph, it involves bouncing a laser pulse off the surface to create a set of data points that can be grouped together to form a model of the landscape below.
There's a lot of research being done about the Trail of Tears, but when you look at the historical archive, when you look at the present day research going on, it's still from an outsider's perspective. There's very little Cherokee voice or perspective that is being drawn into this research.
The summer of 1838, there was a severe drought, and it was extremely hot that year. So that the first 3 groups that were sent from Ross's Landing to present Chattanooga, Tennessee, there's a high mortality rate, at least among the last group that left.
At the year that happened, it was the hottest summer and the coldest winter on record. And so people perished in the camps waiting for cool weather, and then when they did get started, it was the most harsh winter. There wasn't much rain. The rivers didn't have enough water for water transportation, and thousands of people died.
So the Cherokees, because of the high mortality rate, petitioned General Winfield Scott to see if they could delay the removal until the rain started. Because, well, there's also a drought during the period. And the last 2 detachments that had left ran aground in Arkansas and then had to walk the rest of the way. So after they'd agreed to delay it, then the Cherokees asked if they could be in charge of their own removal. And from that point on, there were always adequate provisions on the entire trail.
Geospatial specialist Chris Dunn is working on a project to map all the known routes and sites along the Trail of Tears in Missouri.
What I'm doing is I'm taking in documents and then finding the locations within those documents and then entering that information into the geographic information system so that archaeologists, historians, and others can interpret their findings, and it also helps them look for additional sites that may be of interest to them as they do their research. This map is showing the area south and west of St. Louis, which is the area where the Trail of Tears took the northern route. This was the route as it was described without any correction for magnetic variance and the change of true north. And this is the route cleaned up and made to go from the start point to the proper end point. And by being able to precisely map the route as it goes through a particular area, we're able to use historic records and identify who might have been the owners of the property at the time. We may be able to identify the families that have descended from those owners, and we might be able to talk to folks and see if they had any records or contemporaneous writings or notations in the family Bible of this event when, the Cherokees were forced to move through this area.
Research at witness sites along the Trail of Tears is helping us understand how the Cherokee interacted with the communities they passed through during their forced removal. Cave Springs in southwest Missouri is one such site.
We are at a rock shelter in southern Missouri along the Trail of Tears, south of Lebanon, Missouri. We're here because the trail came through near here. So what we're going to do, we're going to put in a few test units this weekend. It's an archaeological unit where we map out a meter by meter area. We'll take it down 10 centimeters at a time, and so when we get it back to the lab, we'll clean these things up, and we'll be able to get a better sense of what time periods each of these layers represent as we're going down. And so it'll give us a better idea of this cave during that moment in time when the Cherokee were coming through on their way to Oklahoma.
The road to Springfield led them up onto the Springfield Upland Plain, and it was a 2 mile by 2 mile area known as Big Prairie, and so that road that they intersected with was the St. Louis to Springfield Road, a postal road, a road that was well established, well marked, well traveled, and that road would lead them ultimately to Indian territory.
Cave Springs was the post office and trading post that was operated by A.B.O. Parks. The historic link to this place with the Cherokee story is the B.B. Cannon group that came through in 1837. We know from documentation, from his diary, and from the paid invoices, they stopped there at a gentleman named Samuel Grigsby, had a farm there. The Cherokee campsite was about a mile up the hollow from this cave. In an economy that was based on reciprocity, on barter, the road represented opportunity. It's what brought them here, but it was also opportunity for cash money. The Cherokee did pay their way as they went through, and the dollar exchange was important.
We're here at the bottom of our second level in this unit here in the rock shelter, and we've come down on what we think is a fire pit or a hearth. We think it's a fire pit or a hearth because we have a little kind of semicircular stain here in the soil that is indicative that the soil was heated at some point in time, and that has caused the soil to change colors. We've come down on the very top of it here. So what we're going to do now, we're going to clean off the rest of our unit, get the loose dirt out, and then we'll take measurements of where this feature is within our unit. And we'll go ahead and start working down on the feature itself and see if we can find anything in it that would help tell us exactly what this fire pit was used for, find any artifacts in it that might help us date it, charcoal, where we might be able to do carbon-14 dating, any of that kind of material that may be inside this little area of burned soil that we have.
The charcoal was found in a layer with Mississippian flint point fragments just above a late woodland projectile point, suggesting that people had been using the site for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Brett Riggs has spent much of his career researching sites associated with the Cherokee removal. Brett explained how a combination of archaeological excavation and local knowledge has helped locate internment sites where Cherokee were imprisoned in stockades to await their removal.
Okay, so here's some material from the Fort Armistead site. Fort Armistead is right on the trail in eastern Tennessee. So the deportees from North Carolina pass through Fort Armistead. It's a stopover point. So as our initial phase of the survey, we conducted a systematic, comprehensive metal detection survey of the site. The results of that, the pattern revealed from that was very interesting. It was highly structured. We could actually see in the distribution of metal artifacts the outlines of buildings. So for instance, here's a whole array of cut nails, and most of the metal artifacts that we see in the site metal detected are cut nails. They're construction hardware. The plan for the fort from the period of the removal, which was just a linear arrangement along the top of the hill, even though approximately 3,200 Cherokee prisoners passed through this site, there's no really definitive material that we can identify as being associated with that. We're currently working in the Fort Cass Immigration Depot, those boundaries, trying to define first and foremost evidence of the camps of Cherokee detainees there. We identified the location on the basis of local oral history. The man who owned the site at the time that we first started work actually brought us there, toured us around, showed us various features, and identified those features. For instance, a powder magazine. And I asked him, I said, how do you know this is a powder magazine and this is a fort? And he said that when he purchased the land in the 1970s, an elderly gentleman in the area, a man who was then in his 90s, walked around the site with him and pointed out these things and recited what each of these things represented. And I said, well, how did he know? And he said, well, his grandfather was posted here.
Oral histories from both local Missourians and members of the Cherokee Nation enhance the preservation efforts in this community. The cooperation of diverse people coming together to remember a turbulent time in their history is what makes this project special. Nearly 200 years after the violent collision of cultures, Americans are working together to remember, discover, and to preserve.
My grandmother died in 1968 when she was 103 years old. That says that she was born in 1865, right at the end of what would be the Civil War. This story that she told me was about a place that she'd never been to and had never seen. So intricate was the description of this place that some 30 years later, I was able to come here and actually see not only where she was talking about, but to see what she was talking about. In 1991, when I came, I had no idea where that town of Katua would have been. It could have been in Georgia, it could have been in Tennessee, it could have been in Virginia, it could have been anywhere. No one had ever told me where it was. She didn't know exactly where it was, apparently. She didn't say. But she said it was in a valley, it was next to a river, and she began the description of where this town was geographically. On my way to Bryson City one morning to buy some groceries, I passed by a large farm that I'd passed by probably 100 times, and the whole field, this huge field there in that valley, was completely covered in corn, and it was all the same size. It was all the same height, except for one area right in the middle of it that looked as though it had a hump in it. And it occurred to me that it might be a mound. And I knew I know what mounds are. I know what townships were a long time ago and what they consisted of. Standing on the side of the road on a little pull-off, the memory of what my grandmother said about what that town looked like all began to come back, because I saw all of the things that she was talking about. The town was on a bend of a river, she said. To the east, there was two mountains. One was closer than the other, but it made it look as though there were a V. And she said that the sun would rise on one half of the slope on one side, on the left side, in the summer, and then would travel or would come up in different places, all the way down to the V and then back up again. And the sun would set directly over, if one was facing east, the sun would set directly over one's right shoulder if one were in the middle of the town. And there would be a valley there. And up that valley was where the men who had founded the town, who had been called there to originate the town and to start the Katua people, had gone up that valley to the highest point in the mountains and received their guidance and the fire and what we call the laws of Katua. And standing there by the highway, I saw all of that right there. And the words of my grandmother then came back alive right at that particular moment. And I realized that I was standing in the origin place of our people as Katuas and as Cherokees. This was where we had started from. This is where we had begun the process of becoming a people. We don't have so much of a cosmology as we have a cosmography. What is to our people the most important thing that we have is our identity being tied to where we come from, place.
Despite its role in the American story, precious little archaeological work has been done at places along the Trail of Tears. So the research at an encampment site like the Snelson Brinker Farm is vitally important.
It's a horrific story of human suffering, but maybe trying to do some of the archaeology will help us kind of figure out how people are managing to survive this awful event.
So when the Trail of Tears detachment was here, the agricultural fields of the Snelson Brinker cabin were right down here in this low spot.
As far as we're aware, we don't have any maps that locate the areas that they were actively farming while they were living here. So,
and the detachments had about 1,000 people each?
Yeah.
That's a lot of people. That would have been a sizable camp.
And we also have
1,000 people, my goodness.
I mean, think of the livestock and the wagons that would have also been associated with that. You need a lot of space.
Yeah, in that sense,
There's sort of a spring back there, which again makes me think that maybe that would be a better place to look for possible campsites, because with that many animals, that many people, you're going to need water. So, but that is currently owned by the state of Missouri, so we'll have to get permission to do any work over there.
Their trail, the road that they took, was right here next to the cabin.
So, and it goes right in front of it. It makes sense that they would have stopped. We know that about that period or a little earlier, they were using the cabin as a courthouse. And I don't know if it did so much while the Brinkers were here, but the Brinkers hadn't been here very long before all of this happened. It's an interesting snippet of American history where, you know, there's a lot of stress going on at this time, and understanding, I guess, the dynamics helps us understand the beginnings of our country in a way that we haven't focused on enough, I think. We've also done metal detecting survey on the property. That was particularly interesting in that we found some things that we weren't looking to find. We were just poking around and we thought, oh, you know, we'll do a brief examination of the field. We're not going to find much, probably just farm stuff. And then, you know, we'll see what happens. And we got into it and we found a structure that we had no previous idea was there. It didn't show up on the ground penetrating radar. It didn't show up on, you know, any photogrammetry shots of flat areas or anything like that. It doesn't show up in any oral histories from the area, so it's really exciting for us because we're getting a better idea of what this space looked like at various points in the past.
The find here was 6 to 8 inches, so that's how deep we're going to try and go here. If the gravel will allow us to go that deep.
The discovery of an 1841 half-dime suggests that there was a cash economy in the area around the ironworks. This is unusual in a region where barter was the norm.
So next, we'd like to do some random excavations throughout the area. I'd like to put a unit in that field to see if we might discover more about what that structure, that unidentified structure, might have been used for at the time. I'd also like to do a unit inside the house itself, inside structures like that, in front of fireplaces and such. You have a better tendency to pick up things that you might find from women's work.
Aaron and Kelly dug a test pit at the back of the house to see if they could find traces of the original foundation. Like the rest of the cabin, the foundations were restored in the 1980s. Their excavation uncovered 19th century cut nails and evidence of the fire's intensity.
There's gotta be a square cut nail or something.
Nice. That's melted glass.
Wow.
Yeah, it got so hot, but it just...
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Wow, look at that. It completely morphed it.
Criminal investigations into the arson continue. To date, no arrests have been made. As the research for Phase 1 draws to a close, Erin discussed the plans for the next phase of the project.
We'd like to have a better idea of, how all of these people come together to make this place this place. We have, Native peoples. We have Native peoples who lived here a long time before any of these other people showed up. We do have a site here that also reflects that. We'd like to understand the Snelsons. We'd like to understand the Brinkers. We'd like to understand the slaves who are living here. The fact that they're, 2 miles from large-scale industry in the area. They have an open pit iron mine just down the road. And so we have, probably pre-contact Osage who were living here at some point. We have this Trail of Tears that comes through. We have the Snelsons who move out after a few years living here. We have the Brinkers who are living here. We have their slaves or enslaved individuals who are living here. And all of these people are coming together in this place and trying to conceive of what it means to be American. And so any archaeology that we're hoping to do here will sort of get at those relationships.
Europeans immigrated here by choice, African Americans by force, and Native Americans were removed to make way for a new way of life. The Trail of Tears, the story of a journey, is the glue that binds these narratives. It's the one thing that all these people and all these cultures have in common. Displacement is the shared American experience, making sites along the Trail of Tears important to us all. Erin and the team at the Snelson Brinker farm were unable to identify Cherokee graves on the property, and while research continues, there are no plans to excavate graves of any sort. While we may never know exactly where they were laid to rest, it remains a sacred site for Native peoples, and is one of the small handful of places along the Trail of Tears where we know the names of the people who were buried there.
The origins of our people, the origins of who we are, the origins of what we are intrinsically tied to the very land that we lived on. That constitutes place in the world. It constitutes not only her memory, but the memory of all Kituwa people about where they come from. And I believe that if we forget that, if we forget where we come from, if we forget how things began for us, then we also somehow begin to forget who we are. So maybe my grandmother was instituting that concept of place, that old, ancient, integral part of being a Kituwa person, a Cherokee person, by simply telling that story. Maybe just to let me know that someday I might need that story to find out who I am. And maybe to find out who she was and who we all are.
I think the true story of the Trail of Tears is that we as the Cherokee people survived the trail, we adapted to our new lands, and after a few generations, that is our home now. And we are thriving now. We have more than 360,000 of the Cherokee Nation.
They came to Indian Territory and immediately started to rebuild. They had a new constitution, built the Supreme Court. The oldest public building in the state of Oklahoma is the Supreme Court building of the Cherokee. Because even though we had won in the Supreme Court that they could not remove us, Andrew Jackson, he went ahead and moved us by bayonet point. But we didn't give up on law and order and justice and those thoughts and beliefs.
Cherokees, they honor the law and they put more confidence in the institutions of the United States than they should have. They put more confidence in the integrity of the United States than they should have. They believed that justice would be done, and it wasn't. It was a huge failing. It's always been a stain on the United States, what happened during that time. And by the way, we're not a footnote in history. We're living, we're breathing, we're building, we're contributing to this country.
Funding for this film was provided by the Missouri Humanities Council as part of its Native American Heritage Program, and by the Western Michigan University Department of History Burnham McMillan Endowment Fund.